if we haven't met, I'm Kat. Hi, I am currently the Land Trust Project Coordinator for the Mississippi Corridor Program area. But before that, I was a biologist and educator for about 10 years, and pollinators happen to be my specialty. So today we're going to be talking about Minnesota's pollinators and what you can do to help them. So I guess we'll get started. I like to start with defining what pollination is to make sure we're all on the same page. So when I'm talking about pollinating, it's basically you're moving pollen grains, which you can see here, from the male part of a plant to the female part of a plant. And this is usually on the flower. And about 3/4 of all the world's plants require an animal to do this for them. So there are lots of different kinds of pollination strategies out there, like wind, but most of them do require animal pollinators. So this has huge impacts for the human world, specifically for our food supply. A lot of the foods that we use for a lot of our nutritional needs come from pollinator-dependent crops. So a lot of fruits and vegetables, coffee, but also some things that you might not think of right away. So the dairy section, for example, at a grocery store looks like this when it's fully stocked. But if pollinators weren't around, it would look pretty different. So the forage that our dairy animals eat, goats and sheep and cows, includes legumes like alfalfa. And these are actually pollinator dependent crops. So without a pollinator to create the seed from which these forage crops grow, the dairy section would look a little bit different. So say goodbye to strawberry flavored yogurts and hello to I can't believe it's not butter. And that's also forage that is used by our wool producing animals. So if you're wearing wool right now, you may have a pollinator to thank for it indirectly. And then looking at the wider picture outside of the human world, pollinators are critically important for a lot of different ecosystems across the globe, including here in Minnesota, a lot of our own ecosystems, such as the tall grass prairie that's pictured here. So I have a little quiz for you. This is a picture of 10 different insects. So just take a moment and try to figure out how many are bees and come up with a number if you can. All right, so if you have your number, I'll tell you the answer. There are 6 different bees pictured in this diagram. And this can be kind of a tricky question. So if you got it wrong, don't feel bad. This was actually part of a recent survey given out, and only 14 out of 100 people get it right. So that's bees. But if you look at it again and try to figure out how many of these 10 insects might be pollinators, the answer changes again. Just about all of them actually might be pollinators, with the exception of this grasshopper that's not pollinating anything. So, as you could probably tell from the quiz, bees are extremely diverse, and generally speaking, they're the most critical pollinators for a lot of different kinds of plants. So here we have the honeybee. This is usually the animal that people picture when they picture a pollinator. But you should know that honeybees are not native bees here in the United States. So the honeybee was actually brought to the Americas as livestock from places where people have kept them for thousands of years. But in North America, they've actually only been around for a few hundred years. You might also picture the bumblebee, and this is one of many native species of bees that we do have here in North America. But together, honeybees and bumblebees only make up about 0.1% of all the different species of bees that are out there in the world. There are about 400 species that can be found here in Minnesota. And the species of bees out there in the world are very diverse. So they include honeybees and bumblebees, but also a lot of other different kinds of bees. So generally you can tell a bee, especially a female bee, because they'll have special pollen carrying hairs on their body, and they're often found on the legs, like you can see here, but not always. Some of them, like this leafcutter bee, have pollen-carrying hairs on the underside of their abdomen instead. And some bees have hairs that aren't even made for carrying pollen. This is a male bee that uses his in presumably some sort of mating ritual. They can have long antennae, like this longhorn bee, or long tongues for getting down into very deep flowers where the nectar is stored, or even long faces. This is a bee from Chile that's so rare and remote that its scientific name is the only name that it has. And that's just bees. There are a lot of other insects that can do pollinating. Flies, beetles, and wasps. And of course, butterflies and moths are the main insect groups that do pollinating services for plants across the world. And in the vertebrate world, we also have some animals that are pollinators, including birds and bats. They tend to be animals that fly. Here in Minnesota, the ruby-throated hummingbee is probably our #1 bird pollinator that we would see. So the bad news is that we're losing our pollinators. We're losing our insects, we're losing our invertebrates, we're losing birds and bats. We're losing life on this planet at a rate that hasn't been seen for more than 100 million years. Why? Well, the answer is diversity. So we all know that diversity is the foundation of a healthy community and strong businesses. It's the foundation of a healthy human diet, and it's also the foundation of a healthy planet. So when you're thinking about pollinators and how to design, gardens and pollinator-friendly spaces, try to see the world through the eyes of a pollinator. So here we have a grid of roads and farm fields from southwestern Minnesota, and it goes on like this for miles and miles. So this area doesn't have a whole lot of diversity. There are a few different kinds of plants, probably mostly crop plants. But just 100 years ago, there would have been so many more different kinds of plants, and even so many more different kinds of crop plants. So in our highways, in our road systems, in our farms, in our parks and communities, the world that we've built for ourselves has designed diversity away. And as a result of that, it's not really a world that pollinators and a lot of other wildlife can live in anymore. So we're seeing declines. But the good news with pollinators is that everybody can do something to help pollinators. It doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be difficult, and nothing is too small to make a difference. So really, pollinators only need 3 things: food, somewhere to live, and safety from the things that can kill them. So let's start with food. And by this, of course, I mean flowers. These are sources of nectar and pollen that the pollinators feed on. It's ideal to have at least a few different plants in bloom at all times of the year. So 2 or 3 in spring, 2 or 3 in summer, and 2 or 3 in fall at a minimum. And if you can incorporate native plants into your garden, all the better, because a lot of our native bees are specialists. Some of them can only visit a few different kinds of flowers. Some can only visit one kind of flower. So the more different kinds of flowers you have in general, the more different kinds of pollinators that you'll be able to see. And the really great thing about Minnesota is that it's very easy to have access to a lot of our native plants, including the ones pictured here. We have a lot of commercially available species that grow in a lot of different places in Minnesota and at all times of year. And that's not something that every state has, so we're very lucky. And when I talk about food resources, it's not just flowers. Trees and shrubs can be a really important source of pollen. These tend to be some of the very earliest things that open. So the early risers in the pollinator world that wake up before some of the later season pollinators do rely on pollen from some of these plants to be able to forage on. And when I'm talking about food plants, I'm also not just talking about flowers. So there's another thing called a host plant that's important in the pollinator world. And this more specifically relates to things like butterflies and moths. So these are animals that they don't even really touch a flower until they're adults. For most of their lives, they're crawling around on the leaves, eating those. So the most famous host plant in this regard is probably the monarch butterfly's milkweed plant, which you can see here. So sometimes the host plant also has flowers, and sometimes it doesn't. So there are ways to look up different host plants for different species of butterflies and moths that you might want to see in your yard, and plant them accordingly. So that brings us to homes. The butterflies and moths are kind of transient. They'll just lay eggs wherever, but bees tend to have a specific place where they stay and don't venture too far from. So most of our native bees do not nest in hives, with the exception of bumblebees. The vast majority of them just kind of keep to themselves. If you disturb them, you're not going to awaken the swarm that's going to chase you. For the most part, they live a solitary life, or sometimes they'll have a little community of different nests, but keep to themselves. So these are bees that are not too terribly likely to sting you. And a lot of them, actually most of them, live in the ground instead of in hives. So these are nests, which is different from a hive. And if you have ground nesting bees in your yard, some of their nests might look like this from the top, and underneath they could look a little bit more like this. So in general, bees tend to be fond of loose soil in dry, warm, sometimes sloped places. So keeping in mind that most of our native species of bees do need some soil to nest in, it's always a nice idea to have bare patches of soil somewhere in your yard, maybe somewhere it's hidden if you don't like the way it looks. And it's also something to keep in mind in spring when it's time to till up the garden. A lot of our species of bees don't nest too far from the plants that they visit. So if you're going really deep into the soil to churn it up for next year's planting, you could be disturbing some of these soil nesting bees. But they don't all nest in the ground. About a third of them nest in plants. So again, these aren't hives. These are cavities that a female will excavate and fill with a pollen ball and a single egg. And then each cavity will hatch into next year's bee. So they'll go for things like dead wood. This can be snags, which is a dead tree, or wood piles sometimes, which is pictured here on the left, or hollow or pithy, which means soft-stemmed plants. So things like elderberry. These are plants that you'll often find bees nesting in. So it's a nice idea to have nesting features for pollinators in your yard, in addition to flowers and host plants. And on the topic of some of the stem nesting bees, you might end up finding plants in your yard that have these weird holes cut out of them, almost like someone went out there with a hole puncher and just took a bunch of pieces. That's the work of leafcutter bees. They really like rose bushes in particular. So if you have rose bushes and they look like Swiss cheese, that's actually a good sign. So it means you have a robust colony of leafcutter bees nearby that take the little circles and use them to line their nests with. And it doesn't mean that it's something to spray. It doesn't really hurt the rose. And actually, that's a good segue to the third thing that pollinators need, which is safety. And there are a lot of things out there that can harm pollinators. And generally speaking, the first thing that comes to mind when having this discussion would be pesticide. So there's a lot of different ways that plants and subsequently pollinators can be exposed to pesticide, whether it's sprayed on to a plant, or sometimes it's found on a seed coating when you put your seed into the ground. Occasionally, you can go to a nursery and purchase a plant that's already been treated with a pesticide. So you can see this picture on the right. It's phrased in a way that makes it sound like a good thing, but you'll see it's been treated with neonicotinoids, which is a sort of pesticide that is quite bad for pollinators. So generally, if you are using pesticide, it's best to avoid systemics. So a systemic pesticide is something that circulates throughout a plant's system. And instead of targeting a specific pest that will go for the plant, it will target any animal that comes in contact with the plant, at least as long as that compound is circulating. So that means it can have non-target effects on some of our beneficial animals, including pollinators. So it's always a good idea to check your tags or the back of your seed packets and avoid things that are systemics. It's best to avoid neonicotinoids as well for the sake of pollinators. And keep in mind that just because something says that it's organic, as far as pesticide compounds, it does not mean that it is safe for pollinators. So it's a large, confusing world of pesticides out there, made more so by the fact that sometimes they go by their trade names, and sometimes they go by their common name. So one of the things that I recommend doing if you are curious about whether a pesticide might have some effects on pollinators, and this can be anything like a farm compound that farmers typically use, or something that is more homeopathic, even like rosemary oil, you can just Google UCB precaution and you'll come up with this tool. And this is a tool that allows you to look up either by common name or trade name different kinds of pesticides, and it'll give you a rating from red, yellow, or green that'll tell you how safe it is for bees. So for example, this one, you can see it has toxicity to bee species besides honeybees. It doesn't look like there's data on whether it's toxic to young honeybees, but it's got this rating level of red, which means it should be avoided. So different compounds you can look up, it'll give you more information about them. So that's pesticide, but there are a lot of other stressors out there. Light pollution is another one. So some of our pollinators, like moths and bats, will take the night shift, and lights have increased exponentially in the last 100, 200 years, to the point where some of these animals will become confused by the lights. They'll be attracted to them, and that can lead them to become exhausted or even die. And that's not just moths, but also birds. Migrating birds can be confused by a lot of lights left on at night. So imagine migrating 1,000 miles across this landscape, and this is a satellite image of the Twin Cities down till Milwaukee and Chicago at night. It would have looked very different not so very long ago. So an easy thing you can do to mitigate the effects of light pollution on pollinators is just don't leave your lights on outside overnight. Or if you feel like you must, try to use a motion sensor instead of keeping them on continuously, so that we can cut down on the amount of light pollution, with the added bonus of you'll be able to see more stars. So window collisions are more specifically a problem for birds, but they are actually a major contributor of bird mortality in the United States. Generally speaking, the more windows a building has, the more likely it is to cause bird collisions. But there are things you can do to mitigate that. So try to avoid using really highly reflective windows, or if you have them, you can put a coating on to make them less reflective. You can also add decals to some of your windows. So generally, if you're going to do this, a good rule of thumb is the 2x4 rule. So 2 inches vertically by 4 inches horizontally is a space that most birds will not try to fly through. You can also use a physical barrier like paracord that they'll be able to avoid, or just make landscaping decisions knowing that bird collisions in windows can happen. So if you have large windows, try to avoid placing a lot of plants either directly behind them in the building or directly in front of it, as that's more likely to confuse birds into hitting the window. And again, more specifically for birds and bats, cats are a contributor to pollinator mortality. So actually, cats are the #1 contributor to bird mortality, at least in the United States. They kill about 1 billion birds a year, if not more, just in this country. So an easy way to mitigate the effects of that would be to, if you have a cat, not let them wander around outside, or you can contribute to spay-neuter campaigns that are reducing the amount of feral cats. So that's just a tip of the iceberg introduction to pollinators in Minnesota and what you can do to cultivate them around your own home. And if you want some further reading, here are some things that I recommend. Bringing Nature Home by Dr. Doug Tallamy is about landscaping with natives, and it includes pollinators, but also just all kinds of wildlife, and how making a few conscious decisions about how you landscape your yard can have big, powerful effects for your local wildlife. More pollinator specific, the book Attracting Native Pollinators is one of the best resources out there for more of a deep dive into the world of pollinators and how to attract them. It's got a lot of really great pictures here from the Midwest as well. And the tool I mentioned, again, the Google Bee Precaution Pesticide, that generally means it's one of the first things to come up. It's got a really good rating system that makes the confusing world of pesticides a little bit easier to delve into.